Hey everyone, I wanted to give you an update, grand solar minimum update. I wanted to remind you of the historical sunspot observations and the problems that we had going way back to modern minimum, even the Dalton minimum. So we're about ready to go into potentially a new grand solar minimum, and when we start seeing these sunspots start falling off to nothing, that's trouble. And here's what's happened. We're dropping about 10 to 20% per year. And here's the updated chart, and this is showing a cycle, this last cycle, and you can see how this is falling off. And so the question is, what is this next cycle going to be? Is it going to be flatlined, or is it going to be just a little hump and then flatlined, or are we going to recover? Nobody really knows, but this is significantly lower than in the last 100 years. In fact, if I go, let me show you the updated chart. Oh, there we go. So here's the last cycle that we're just completing and about ready to start the new cycle. And if you look across here, that line, we were all the way back in about 1910. So that's what this video I'm going to show you, the guy's talking about that was the last time we were at this low. So the question is, are we going to reach back, even farther? You see where this line is? In the 1800s, it was below that line, and if you have to go all the way to the 1600s to get below that. So if we're going to fall below that, this is going to be many generations before that had been experienced in the past. So listen to this interesting interview and listen how cautious this guy is about how he can't really talk about it. I thought it was really weird. Now, this was back in December last year, but it just kind of came across my news feed in the last couple weeks, and I've been saving it to talk about it.
Much of the country has seen record snow and cold this fall. Scientists say the sun is nearing what's called solar minimum, which is a low point in solar activity. So is there a correlation between a calm sun and a cold earth? Meteorologist Corey Reppenhagen explains.
This is video of the sun that I shot today. Notice the even and unblemished orange surface. No sunspots, which appear when the sun's magnetic field is active. In fact, the sun has been relatively spot-free for more than a year, an indication that it's nearing solar minimum.
The number of spots waxes and wanes over the course of about 11 years.
Scott McIntosh is the director of the High Altitude Observatory and currently the interim director of all NCAR. He says we are about 10 years into the current sunspot cycle, which even at its peak in 2014 was the weakest in nearly 100 years.
So it's been trending down by about 25% per decade.
And now we have a Colorado high country benefiting from a cold and snowy fall, the most early season snow cover across North America in 50 years, and global temperatures dropping slightly over the past 2 years. Those are the kind of numbers that have been fueling speculation that a lack of solar activity is responsible for a cooling Earth.
You got to tread really carefully on when you're talking about it, because it's not widely accepted in the scientific community that that's real.
McIntosh says the sun's energy only varies by about 0.1% at max. Not enough to change weather, but he says its magnetic energy could impact weather more than we think. We just don't know enough about it to draw conclusions. Though he says he won't completely disregard some of the data correlation between cold winters and solar minimums.
If the commercial guys that are making money off this are noticing these empirical relationships between weather and solar activity, then maybe there's something to it.
In Boulder, I'm meteorologist Corey Reppenhagen for Next.
I like that dude's accent. I can hear him talk about the sun all day. McIntosh says we should hit true solar minimum sometime during 2019, but it could take longer, and some computer models show the next sunspot cycle could be even weaker than this last one.
So this is a very interesting interview. We keep hearing about how the sea levels are rising, and the problem is they're using satellites, and many of these satellites are geosynchronous, and they're 20-something thousand miles away, and they're trying to measure things down into inches or less than inches. And you can imagine like trying to measure something through a telescope versus for a very small height versus trying to use land-based measurements. So this guy kind of makes a lot of fun about it that, hey, come on, we've been using these measurements and they're highly accurate, and it doesn't show any changes when you use the land-based measurements. So it makes you wonder what they're really trying to do, and it tells you they're just fudging the data for nefarious reasons.
Daniel Fitzhenry, thank you so much indeed for joining me. Can we start with just explaining to viewers, what is your experience measuring things like sea levels?
Well, we're hydrographic surveyors, and they make the charts that ships navigate by, and the reason for having charts is so that ships don't get bent.
And when it comes to Fort Denison, why is that a good measure of sea levels around Sydney?
Well, to the east of Australia, all the way across to the United States and South America, is the largest body of water on Earth. And the Fort Denison station has been and remains one of the most reliable tide gauging stations and sea level gauging stations in the world.
And the Bureau of Meteorology has been checking records there for more than a century, and there have been other records going back further again. Can you tell us what the records show?
Well, the Bureau of Meteorology started mean sea level records in 1914. They show the highest levels of the tides, the lowest levels of the tides, but mean sea level is the one that we need, say we wanted to calculate the volume in the oceans, or if we want to calculate if sea level is rising or falling.
But when you look at the data that you've, when you look at the data, you see 1914, then it's pretty high, then it stays high for, what, a couple of decades, a decade and a half. Then there's low levels for 3 decades, then higher again at the end of the century. But since then, the last couple of years, it's trended down. It's actually lower now, according to your data, than it was in 1914. What does that tell you?
Well, right now, the sea level at Sydney is about 6 centimetres lower than it was in 1914. Now, sea levels are affected by, on a day-to-day basis, by the moon rotating around the Earth. And in the long term, the small pluses and minuses in mean sea level is affected by the planets moving round the sun in elliptical orbits, and sometimes they're closer to the Earth than they are at other times. So mean sea level varies up and down in the range of 20 centimetres.
So from what you've seen, I mean, look, if I had to draw a straight line from 1914, which was perhaps maybe an anomalous period just then of highs, I don't know. If you drew a straight line over the late 20th century to now, you probably get a small uptick in sea levels around Sydney. But like I say, the last couple of years, as you say, too, those sea levels have since dropped. Is there an overall trend that you can point to, or do you think, well, look, there is no trend, it goes up, it goes down?
Well, taking your example, if we drew a straight line from the 1914 level to the current level, and we projected that, extrapolated that, which is what a lot of people, ill-informed people have done, then we would have a downward trend, and if we extended that straight line for 100 years, it would be a drop in sea levels in the range of 30 centimetres. If we took a recent high point in mean sea levels and we connected that line to the current mean sea level and projected it, we'd have an extreme downward trend in sea levels. But if you look at the Bureau's levels, recorded levels over this 100-year period, they rise and fall in the range of 15 centimetres.
Well, is there something different going on in, our east coast. I mean, maybe tectonic plate movement, maybe the land is rising because we are told that we are getting sea level rises through satellite measurements. Or is the on-the-ground measurement the one we really should be paying attention to, and it's not showing the sea level rises that we've been told to expect?
Well, I'm sure that the Fort Denison recorded data by the Bureau of Meteorology is more valuable and more accurate than satellite data on sea levels. Well, that might explain why Venice is still not underwater too. I don't know. David Henry, this is a real mystery, but as you say, the hard evidence is right in front of us. Maybe the people like Tony Abbott who are wandering out to the beach saying this actually hasn't changed may be right, and the CSIRO, which is predicting nearly 1 metre of sea level rises by the end of the century, maybe, just maybe, they've got a reason to worry. Thank you so much indeed for your time. My pleasure.
So I find it funny. There was a video I watched many months ago. I'm going to have to try to find it, but these guys, engineers, had actually gone in and evaluated these different methodologies for measuring like the Earth's temperature, and they were, just surprised at how the younger scientists were trying to say they could actually resolve, extremely small temperature variations when you can't even do that with a normal thermometer. And so I think it's really just we have some people that are, it's a level of incompetence that they don't understand the capability of their equipment. They just think that if they take more and more measurements, they can average it all out and that it'll actually make sense. But that's just a fallacy in logic. And so the same thing's happening here with trying to measure, wave heights and things like that. And we actually were involved in developing some of this equipment, scatterometers and stuff, and it was mainly for monitoring like storms and things, but it wasn't meant for trying to measure actual average sea heights across the world and stuff. So it's actually kind of bizarre. It's a misuse of tools and such, and so that's where we're headed. So a lot of this, I think we're starting to see people kind of waking up and saying, hey, this isn't right, and we're allowed to now, where before people's jobs were threatened. But even that one guy was pretty cautious about how he talked about it. And so that's the real thing is, are we going to allow science to do its job, or is this still going to be the global warming religion and just silence any critics? So I think it's waking up, and I think we've got something coming for the future here. And unfortunately, we've lost a lot of time to prepare. So anyways, I hope everybody's treating you well. I hope you're doing well. Do the best you can. God bless.